Hey everybody, this is Dan. I want to share with you a position here that comes from a blitz game that I played recently, and kind of show you the way that this game concluded from this point. And there's a few principles and basic ideas that are, I think, well illustrated by this game. So, looking at this position, you can see that black has a rook and four pawns, which is a total of 9 points of material. The rook is 5 points, the pawns are 1 point each. And white has a knight and two pawns, the knight being 3 points, the pawns 1 point each. So white has 5 points. So black has a 4 point lead in material, a significant lead. And in situations like this where you've reached an endgame, and even if you haven't reached an endgame and you have a big lead in material, one thing that you can consider is that it's often okay to exchange pieces, even if you're giving up a stronger piece for a weaker piece, because often the resulting position will be simplified to a point that it's actually easier to win. So, in the spirit of that, if you were black here, and there's definitely not just one move to play here. I'm sure there are other moves that are quite viable, but in considering that principle of exchanging off pieces, even if you're losing more than you're getting back, what do you think I played here? So if you want to think about it for a minute, as always, you can pause the video, think about it, and then press play. Okay, so in this position, I actually played rook captures knight on g3, just wanting to get down to a simplified king and pawn endgame in which I have 4 pawns against white's 2 pawns. So, of course, white answered by capturing the rook, and then I continued by centralizing my king on e5, and I'll kind of move through this quickly because I don't think it's necessary for me to really talk too much about each move. So anyway, white continued by moving to h4. White's idea is to, I guess, capture my kingside pawns. Sorry, my kingside pawns on h5 and g4. And I continued by moving my king again to e4, and white captured my pawn on h5. And keep in mind, we're playing this at blitz speed, so really quick and lots. I'm sure those of you who are watching this, you can see plenty of things that could be improved, and that's because this is a blitz game. So at this point, I guess one thing I could do is just push the pawn to g3, at which point white doesn't really have any way to stop that pawn from promoting. So I didn't do that. In the game, I played king to d3, simply trying to get the c3 pawn from white in exchange for my 2 pawns on the king side. And so after white captured on g4, I captured on c3. White brought the king to the center with king f4, and then I just started to push my passed pawn from d4 to d5. So white brings the king down to try to stop the pawn, but at this point my king and pawn are too strong and this pawn cannot be stopped. So I pushed again, white moved into e3, I pushed again, white moved to e2, brought my king to c2, protecting the d1 queening square, which is always important in these kinds of endgames. And then white just moved the king, since there's really nothing better to do. The king obviously can't, it's illegal to move to d1 or e1, and since white can't pass, the only thing white can do is move to an inferior square. So it doesn't even matter at this point because my king is protecting my pawn, so even if it were black's move here, the pawn could just promote, and then obviously that queen would be immune from capture because the king protects the d1 square. So anyway, the king moves, and I promoted to a rook. I'm not really sure why, but maybe subconsciously I wanted to demonstrate one of the things that I will be demonstrating later in this video, which is how to checkmate with the lone rook and king versus a king. So it turned out well for that reason, if nothing else. Okay, at this point white moved to e4, not much else to do, and I moved my rook to a1, followed by king to d5, and rook to a5, attacking the pawn on b5. Okay, the king goes to c6, defending the pawn, and then I bring my king in to try to use the king and rook together to grab that pawn. And you'll see here white has just grabbed another pawn on b6, but I didn't really care about that. So I brought my king to b4, then white needs to move, so king goes to c6, and I captured the pawn. Okay, so obviously the rook can't be captured because the king protects it. So we're brought to a rook and king versus king situation, which is one of the basic end games that it's really, really valuable to know how to handle, because this really will happen. It's less common than having a lone queen and king versus a king, but this does happen as well. So in this position, white would do best to stay as close to the center as possible. So white plays king to d6. And now what you need to remember is when you have a rook and a king, the king needs to stay close to the rook in order to protect it. And the plan is for the king and rook together to drive the opposing king into one of the corners. So in this particular game, I wanted to drive my opponent's king to the h8 corner. And in order to do that, I need the rook and king to work as a team. So what I do, and this is the technique for this ending, is play rook to c5, which blocks the c-file and also blocks the fifth rank. So you'll see that the white king is restricted as if there's a box around the white king. The rook is kind of creating a box around the white king. And so the rook is pushed back. The white king is pushed back. So the king goes to e6, my king goes to c4 because the rook can't go to d5 yet. If it were to do that, obviously it would just be lost, and that would be a drawn position. So instead, after king to e6, I played king to c4, followed by king to d6. White is doing well to stay as centralized as possible. And then my rook is doing a good job of boxing the king at this point, so all I do is move my king closer to the center while still protecting my rook. So king to d4. And now the white king must give ground. So white plays king to e6, and now I use the rook and king together to push further. Rook to d5, you'll see the technique starts to be repetitive. King to f6, rook to e5, king to g6, and then my rook can't push any further because it would not be protected by the king. So king to e4, king to f6, king to f4, just like before. The pieces are doing the same pattern, just the position on the board has moved. So the king is forced to give ground again, goes to g6, rook to f5, creating a smaller and smaller box around the white king, eventually forcing the king to the h8 corner. Okay, king to h6, rook to g5. Now the only move for white is to move the king up to h7, after which I moved my king to f5, after which white moved to h6 again with the king, and I moved to f6. So white again has one move, king to h7, and now I bring my rook to box the king even more tightly into the corner, and the king must move king to h8. Now here, one thing that you have to be careful of is rook to g7 would be a mistake because that is a stalemate and a draw, since white is not in check but has no legal moves. So you want to be careful of stalemate in this particular situation. Instead of that, this gives me an opportunity to demonstrate one more idea called triangulation. What you might be wanting to play here is king to f7, after which king to h7 is played, and the king can't leave the protection of the rook since the white king would then capture it. So black is kind of forced here to go back to f6, after which the king goes to f8, and if this is repeated, it would just be a draw if the moves are repeated 3 times. So what you really have to do here is, let me go back, what you really have to do here is, as black, waste a move, essentially waste a move, which amounts to, instead of moving the king to f7 in 1 move, you want to move to f7 in 2 moves. So what I played here was king to e7. And you'll see that the difference is that the white king is not in position to capture the black rook. So the only move is king to h7. After which, my king moves to f7 now, but this situation is different because now the white king is forced into the corner with king to h8, and my king is now on f7, which allows a checkmate in one move. So take a look here, find the checkmate, and you can pause if you need to, and press play when you're ready. Okay, so the checkmate is rook to h6 checkmate. And so in this video I demonstrated three really important ideas. One is that in an endgame, or really in any position in which you have a significant lead in material, when you have more pieces and pawns, it's okay to consider kind of trading more material than you get in return. So giving more than you get, just because when you simplify, it could just be a very clear and easy win. Of course, every game is different, so if you have mating threats, for example, just obviously that takes precedence, but do consider trading, even if you lose some of your material, if you have a lead in material. Okay, the second one is the technique for using the king and rook to push the opposing king into the corner by creating a box and making that box smaller and smaller. And the last thing is kind of the idea of wasting a move with your king in order to create a situation where this checkmate is possible. And that's by moving your king kind of in a triangle from one square to another square in an indirect way. So in this game, the king moved from f6 to e7 to f7 instead of moving directly from f6 to f7, which changes everything because that makes the checkmate possible. So since you can't pass when it's your move in chess, sometimes you have to consider the idea of wasting a move or just using a move in order to force the other player to make a move that they might not want to make. So anyway, I hope that these concepts were useful to you. I hope they'll improve your game, and I most of all hope that you enjoyed watching. And please check out the the Chess Classroom on Facebook, and keep looking for more videos on YouTube. And I'm really happy to share with you guys. So thank you very much.